All right, let's dive into a real puzzle at the heart of the modern workplace. We're going to explore a new way of thinking that helps explain why discrimination is so stubborn, even when, most people are trying to do the right thing. It's this kind of hidden bias, and figuring out what it is, well, that's the first step to actually doing something about it.
So this whole mystery really kicks off with some numbers that honestly just don't seem to add up. You've got one set of data that says our attitudes as a society have gotten way better. But then you look at the data on workplace bias, and it's telling a completely different and much more frustrating story.
And that brings us to the big question, right? If explicit, out in the open prejudice is at an all-time low, why is workplace discrimination still so incredibly persistent? I mean, the surveys show this steady decline for decades. So if that's true, why aren't we seeing that progress when it comes to hiring people? It's a total head-scratcher.
Okay, so let's look at the good news first. On one hand, you have real evidence of progress. According to Pew Research, only 5% of adults in the U.S. rate Black Americans as very cold on what they call a feeling thermometer. That is a huge shift in what people are willing to say out loud, and it shows a massive change in public attitudes over the years. But here's the flip side. That 5% number sounds great, right? But then you look at these massive resume studies, where they send out identical resumes with different names, and they consistently find a 20 to 40% rate of discrimination. And the most shocking part? That number has barely moved an inch since 1989. That's a huge disconnect. So what gives? How do we explain this massive gap between what we say we believe and what actually happens? Well, to figure that out, let's start by looking at the usual suspects, the classic theories about discrimination, and see why they just don't quite cut it anymore.
Okay, so for ages, the two big explanations were pretty straightforward. You had taste-based discrimination, which is basically just old-fashioned prejudice, and statistical discrimination, which is using stereotypes as a kind of mental shortcut. But here's the problem. Both of those theories predict that bias should fade away as markets get more competitive and as we get more information about people. And, well, it clearly hasn't.
The fact that it's so persistent suggests that there's something else going on. Something subtler, something better adapted to our modern world. And that's what brings us to a new theory, a new framework that might just be the missing piece of this whole puzzle. This new theory is called Taste-Based Statistical Discrimination, or TBSD for short. And you can think of it like a hybrid of the old ideas. It works in two stages. First, a decision maker sees a visible cue, like someone's race or gender, and they use it to guess at a hidden identity, like someone's political views. Then, they apply their own personal feelings, their animus, which is really just a fancy word for dislike, not to the person's race, but to that identity they just guessed. All right, so let's really break down how this plays out in the real world, because this isn't about some kind of conscious evil plan. It's a mental shortcut, something that can happen totally under the radar, which is exactly what makes it so powerful and so tricky to deal with. It really is this two-step mental process. So in step one, your brain sees a demographic cue and makes a quick, probabilistic guess about something you can't see, like a person's values or their politics. Then comes step two, where you have an emotional reaction, a dislike, not to the person's race or gender itself, but to the values you just assumed they have. And this table here perfectly illustrates why that first step, the inference, is so powerful. The truth is, in our highly sorted world, demographics have become surprisingly good predictors of things like politics. Look at this. Knowing someone is Black means there's an 83% probability they lean Democrat. Knowing they're a white evangelical Protestant, an 85% probability they lean Republican. Our brains are pattern-matching machines, and they absolutely pick up on these strong correlations. But okay, it gets even more powerful. Let's look at what happens when these cues start to stack up. See, a single piece of information on its own might not tell you much. So for example, if all you know is that an applicant is white, their political leaning is pretty much a 50-50 toss-up. It's not a very strong signal at all. But what happens when we add another layer of information? Let's now consider a white woman who also has a postgraduate degree. Suddenly, you've got multiple cues working together.
And boom, when those cues combine, the guess gets a whole lot stronger. That 50-50 coin flip, it suddenly jumps to a 70% probability that she's a Democrat. Just like that, in a hiring manager's mind, a vague idea can harden into a pretty confident assumption.
And this isn't just a theory. We've got experimental evidence to back it up. One incredible study found that this inferred political identity was actually a stronger predictor of bias than race was. Get this. Conservative evaluators in the study actually rated a black conservative target more favorably than a white liberal one. The bias literally followed the perceived politics, not the race.
So that covers the inference part of the process. But what about the animus, the dislike? Well, this whole psychological mechanism is basically having gasoline poured on it by something that's running hotter than ever in our society: political polarization.
This is the engine driving stage 2 of TBSD. There's a clinical term for it: affective polarization. But all it really means is that partisans, people on different political teams, increasingly dislike, distrust, and just plain don't like each other. And it's that negative feeling that gets triggered the moment your brain makes that guess about where someone stands politically.
Okay, so why is understanding all this so important? What's the real-world impact? Well, it matters because this subtle, easy-to-deny kind of bias has very real, very damaging consequences for individuals, for teams, and for the entire company. I mean, it causes real psychological harm, it breaks that crucial link between performance and reward, and it can totally fragment a team. But here's the most dangerous part. It provides a kind of moral alibi. It lets a manager reject someone not because of their race or gender, which they know is wrong and illegal, but because they're not a good cultural fit, a fuzzy judgment that's really just a stand-in for, I don't think they share my values. And you bet this has a real, tangible cost. When an employee quits because they feel like they just don't fit in ideologically, it costs the company about 33% of their annual salary to replace them. This isn't just some abstract social issue. It's a serious problem that hits the bottom line. So this TBSD framework, it really does solve that paradox we started with. It shows that bias didn't disappear, it just evolved. It's hiding behind a much more socially acceptable mask now. And that leaves us with a really tough, really important question. If bias can hide behind these judgments of values and fit, how do we even begin to build organizations that are truly fair and inclusive? And maybe even more importantly, how do we train ourselves to see the actual person in front of us, and not just the political identity we've projected onto them?